It is called the Great Resignation. A record number of Americans are saying, I quit.
Yeah, folks are going all Johnny Paycheck. Take this job and shove it. What's up with that?
Oh, all kinds of things. We're talking about economics and lifestyle decisions. But here's the really big question. Are you going to quit?
No, man, I need this gig. Radically Rational, the podcast, is next. Hello and welcome to Radically Rational, the podcast. At Radically Rational, you know how this works. We're bringing facts back into fashion and we're making simple sanity sexy again. And if I violate that rule, I will hear about it from an 80-year-old girl.
You sure about that?
In no uncertain terms. Welcome again. I'm Paul Alexander. My partner, Anthony Pittman. First of all, so good to have you here.
Good
man.
to see you.
You are
again,
bringing
Paul.
so much to this show. This is great.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I am enjoying doing this. Trust me.
I try to be a little more verbally and linguistically accurate and precise than
You're
this.
good at
But these are weird times. Would you agree with that?
Oh, without a doubt.
There are a lot of
These
weirdness
weird
going
times
on.
started literally a couple of years ago, it seems like, but it's flown by us.
Got all kinds of ologies involved.
Mm-hmm.
We got psychology, sociology, biology with respect to the pandemic. And it's doing some unprecedented things to our economy. Really interesting stuff. So we welcome to the program the Chief Economic Analyst from Bankrate, Mark Hamrick. Mark, how are you?
Hey.
I'm well, Paul and Anthony. It's a real pleasure to be with you. And when you say simple and sane, my grandmother used to call me a simpleton, so I guess I can qualify there. Sane, that is a judgment call, but we'll do with what we got.
But you know what? That simple sanity is becoming radical. Just being rational. All of a sudden, you're like a Bolshevik or something like that. I'm dying to ask you this question, Mark. Does it hurt your feelings when somebody refers to economics as the dismal science? That would bring me down. That would hurt my feelings.
No, not at all. I learned to take the personal aspects of all this out of the conversation, or at least my mindset, a long time ago. And there's some history to that notion that economics may or may not be easier to forecast than the weather, and the weather is highly uncertain these days. Did anyone see an economic downturn occurring in March and April of 2020 as late as November of 2019? No. So I can understand why people might have that kind of an approach, but as with other aspects of so-called sciences, we shouldn't dismiss the idea of trying to get better or dismiss the idea of trying to be as smart as we can be just because it's less than perfect.
Is it tough, Mark, for you to stay out of the controversy, so to speak, of economy and reading the economy and explaining it to others?
No, I think that's my job. And I'm fortunate in the sense of having been a second generation journalist, in the sense that my dad worked for Associated Press. He was a small town newspaper editor after that. I spent 26 years with AP, and one might ask, well, how is that relevant? As many know who are close to the industry, the AP is a cooperative that's essentially serving and owned by the broader journalism industry. And so it cannot be wedded to a particular ideology other than to try to seek the best information available, and to try to be ethical, to try to be truthful, and to try to be fair. And that's what I need to do, and that's what I try to do in my job at Bankrate. And that is, in any given week, I could be, as I will be after we speak here, I'll be on the Christian Broadcasting Network. I'll be speaking with CBS News. I'll be working with people at the New York Times, Washington Post. So, we work with people no matter what, how they may be viewed on the ideological spectrum, because ultimately the whole world needs to be aware of what's going on with the economy, personal finances, business, and financial considerations. And so much the same as, let's say, walking through a city where there are going to be all kinds of points of view and experiences being brought to bear, I need to be able to work with all those kinds of people.
Mark, I am genuinely, sincerely fascinated by economic psychology. If I hadn't become a mediocre journalist, I would have been very attracted to trying to become a mediocre economist. So we've got this, I guess you describe it as a psychological issue, the Great Resignation. This is fascinating. What is driving this?
Well, we've had a record number of job openings, and in recent months, a record number of people leaving their jobs. And our own bank rate research before Labor Day, it was meant to be time before that day, which celebrates labor. We did a survey that found that at that time, 55% of those in the workforce, which is defined as those working or looking for work, intended to look for new jobs in the coming 12 months. And that was about the time we notched that record high number and rate of people quitting their jobs. And the vast majority of those are leaving those positions to take something else. We also found at that time, and I think it's still valid, that people were and are prioritizing things other than traditional compensation. And the things that they're looking to capitalize on include better flexibility in their jobs. That could be hours worked, such as if you're, let's say, working in the leisure and hospitality, bar and restaurant setting, not working 8 days a week, so to speak, or not working 12 to 15-hour shifts. They're also looking for the opportunity to work remotely, at least some of the time, or to work from home. And of course, as I speak to you, I'm in my home. I have an office in downtown DC, but most people in that part of the universe are not in their offices these days as the pandemic continues. So we've learned that we can do this in a way that we would never have had that opportunity had it not been for a pandemic. So for as many things that were heartbreaking during the pandemic, there have been many epiphanies and reckonings occur during this time. And I think that there's been this, along with, as you said, and reference this phrase, the Great Resignation, I think there's been a great reassessment and a great reshuffling.
Would part of this Great Resignation, Mark, really be about opportunity and money when we just, get down to the brass tacks of it?
Well, it's not all about money, as I just said. People are prioritizing things over dollar signs. And we think about the fact that when we go out into public these days, you can kind of see where the mismatch between the supply and demand of labor is occurring, right? It occurred as early in my memory when we ventured out here in our family over Memorial Day, and I went into a hotel where they just could not serve breakfast, right? And that's truly a first world problem. But to me, it was, you're thinking about things that are different. In downtown DC, for example, around my office, there have been Starbucks which have closed seemingly permanently. So, only during a pandemic would we have seen interruptions in businesses or lack of revenue in places like dentist's office, barber shops, right? Places that previously would have been seen as recession proof. And with that, with the loss of 22 million jobs in March and April of last year, I think that, not only were those numbers and experiences truly shocking for either the people who were experiencing it firsthand, but those of us who are witnessing it broadly, but it also did great damage to the perception that people had about, let's say, the long-term viability of the work or professions they were doing. So, I think that's why people have been slow to go back to some of those jobs, not only because of the reality that they're public-facing jobs. You may have to enforce, let's say, a vaccine mandate on the part of your customers if you're in one of those markets, as was the case in Los Angeles, where I was not that long ago. So you've got someone who might have been previously hired as being a pleasant and attractive person, now being asked to also be the bouncer and ask people for their vaccination card. So, there's that old lead into the TV show about a million stories in the naked city. I think there's a million different storylines that are going on with respect to the good question that you asked there, Anthony.
Mark, you reference, of course, supply and demand because it all comes down to that. And in this case, the commodity is labor. So what caused this flip in the paradigm? Why is that upside down really to a greater degree than maybe any time in American history?
Well, of course, the first part of that is what we just talked about, and that is that essentially 22 million people were whistled off the field and benched And over that time, not all those jobs came right back. So the biggest deficit still occurs or resides in that bar and restaurant, hotel accommodations, live sports and entertainment sector, which is broadly defined by the Labor Department as leisure and hospitality. So, first of all, if you can't go back to the job that you took early on, there was an effort, obviously, and a good effort, I think, made by the federal government to try to keep people whole by those pandemic programs of unemployment assistance, which have since run out. And by the way, for those who were sharply critical of that, there was no evidence whatsoever that in the markets or in those jurisdictions where political leaders opted to end those programs early, there was no evidence to indicate that employment came back any stronger in those markets. A lot of people retired during this time. People who might have looked at their retirement savings, emboldened by a strong stock market performance, and said, you know what, I've actually done better on my retirement savings over this period than I might have otherwise. And then also perhaps viewing that it's no longer worth the hassle, however you might view that. I heard that story from people in healthcare as well. So, I think maybe you said at the outset, in many ways, we've turned the world upside down. We're trying to get it turned right side up, but it won't be anywhere near exactly the same in the future as it was before. And some of that is going to be positive because you have, for example, such a large number of job openings posted, which can be done remotely. So not that far away from where I grew up in Southeast Kansas, a community which might have been formerly overlooked, like Tulsa, Oklahoma, is actually having something of a mini boom right now because it's a relatively inexpensive place to live, yet you can have a remote job there just as you can anywhere else. And so many of these middle-sized communities across the country are all of a sudden finding people are willing to leave more expensive, perhaps more highly populated areas and go to work in a place that doesn't cost as much.
Mark, some analysts don't even want to use the term Great Resignation. In your opinion, though, what's the biggest misconception about the Great Resignation? And I love the term.
I don't know. I don't know that I really feel like there's a huge level of misconception going on with that. I think perhaps, first of all, there's always going to be some imprecision with these broad brushstrokes that we apply to either a trend, whether it's in the totality of that description or in the longevity of it. But, the reality is that the balance of power for many years, I think, in this country was broadly being seen as being possessed by employers or enterprises and business. And workers have sought to recapture some of that power. And I think in some cases, they actually now have it. And so when employers realize that one of the ways that they can attract the workers that they're having a hard time finding is to pay more money, workers are more than happy to take them up on that offer. And, we've seen outside of the compensation space, a high number of union-related job actions across the country in recent months. And that's an interesting one at a time, obviously, when union membership has continued to decline over many, many years. But in that setting, it's completely different because what you're seeking to do is basically improve your situation while staying with your current employer. Obviously, in that situation, your union is a designated bargaining entity. And at some point, this is another way of manifesting itself where people are essentially fed up and they're going to some of their last resorts in the sense of trying to better their situation.
This is fascinating, not just economically, but psychologically. And our guest, and we thank him for joining us, is Mark Hamrick, who is the senior economic analyst for Bankrate. Is there some glee in the workers rising up right now? Is there some kind of feeling, as much as I hate to use this term, we're going to stick it to the man. I have been the nail all my life.
We're going to fight
I got the hammer now.
Well, I mean, I don't know whether I'm the right person to try to characterize that or not, but I think that cyclically, there are times when people feel overwhelmed, and people had felt overwhelmed when that economic downturn occurred in March and April of last year. They felt tremendously overwhelmed during the great financial crisis and recession. In many ways, that was a global condition. And one of the things that I think the current administration, obviously embodied and led by President Biden, is trying to do is provide a talking point for a phrase that he uses quite often, which is along the lines of good paying union jobs. And it's not an accident that as they seek to, for example, increase ownership of electric vehicles, that the planned tax benefit or credit that would be provided under that program goes up if you buy a vehicle from a vehicle that is made in a union shop. I think back to such dynamics as the North American Free Trade Agreement, essentially the variety of movements over the years which have led to globalization. Workers, to some degree, have been on the downside of those trends to the extent that globalization provided an opportunity for employers globally to resource, in other words, resource or rebase their work elsewhere. Technology's been doing that for centuries now. And so with both an acceleration of technology and a rise of globalization, one of the reasons that President Trump came to office, among many, was the fact that people felt as if enough already on globalization. And it's been fascinating to me as one who works in the nation's capital, is that has become one of the few politically uniting dynamics that this deglobalization, as it's been called, is going to continue. And that's one of the reasons why in both parties also, there's a feeling that there should not be a huge effort to repair the relationship with China. So all those things sort of move along the same line. So while we at once perhaps focus on the polarization of the political climate, there are some things that unite people, and deglobalization and the fractious relationship between the U.S. and China is another.
How worried are you about the Omicron variant kind of throwing us back in the soup just when we thought that we were being restored to health, literally and economically?
Well, I mean, I think that we need to be always attentive to the risk of these new variants. And I felt in the early days when the stock market was careening sharply lower here with word of the Omicron variant, that reaction was a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction because, as I said, we've known that was a risk all along, and we experienced a slowdown in the economic recovery over the summer because of Delta. But as we speak, the news from the scientific community seems to be increasingly encouraging that at least 3 vaccinations, for example, with Pfizer, may be sufficient to keep this at bay. And the other positive news, and of course I'm viewing this through the lens of how could this affect the economy, which is, I know why you asked me the question. We also have increasingly positive news with respect to antiviral treatment. So essentially having a way to address the infection after it's already entered the body. So, whether it's COVID-19 or, Lord forbid, the next pandemic or epidemic that moves around the globe, these are always risks. These are always sources of uncertainty. Climate change is another. And I think back to sort of some of our basic mantras at Bankrate, which ultimately is meant to serve people in the sense of helping them to achieve their financial objectives or their personal financial goals. And we come back to some of our basic survey questions and survey work over the years, and that is the number one financial regret on the part of Americans is the failure to save for emergencies and the failure to save for retirement. So how are all those related? Well, we face no shortage of threats to the economy in recent years, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's an episode such as what occurred in Texas nearly a year ago, where one of the most expensive climate-related disasters in history occurred with that freeze and long-term electrical outage. And these events seem to be happening at a quickening pace. So that's why we continue to remind people that we really do need to make our personal savings a priority, because we never know whether it's sort of a large event or it's a personal one where we have a large expense, or perhaps unfortunately face a bout of unemployment. This is the part where we need to create our own social safety net, because we learned at the outset of this pandemic, when we saw the shocking new iteration of food lines where people were in their automobiles instead of on the street as they were during the Depression, that it can get dicey out there in a hurry.
Mark, we can save money for our future if we're making money and if the economy is good or better. When you look at it now, where it stands and where it could be in the next, 4 to 6 months, do you have a positive outlook for that? Because, folks want to hear some kind of positivity.
No, I think there's every reason to be upbeat broadly on the economy in the coming 6 months. First of all, growth this year, which is our main gauge of where the economy is and may be headed, is going to be the best in many years. And the outlook remains for above par growth in 2022. This is the reason why the Federal Reserve is now seen as behind in the effort to sort of get monetary policy where it needs to be. That will probably lead to higher interest rates in the second half of 2022. But ultimately, most of us are not trust fund children. I'm certainly not, quite the opposite of that. And the means by which we achieve some degree of success with our personal finances is through our work, either the work in our household, if we're not a breadwinner in that household, or ultimately, ironically, in our country, a chief means of attaining wealth is through home ownership. And we know there are some structural challenges with that that ultimately have to do with differences with race, but that's the reality. And so home ownership is quite difficult for people right now because there's a shortage of homes available for purchase, and home prices have literally been through the roof for quite some time now, with double-digit increases on a year-over-year basis. But leaving that aside, inflation is really the number one problem I think that people are facing outside of the pandemic itself. And inflation in many ways was caused by the pandemic. As we reopened the economy in an unprecedented way in a hurry, it was easier, as it turns out, to shut down the economy than it was to open it back up. And so there's been this global traffic jam of goods. Again, we talked earlier about the mismatch of demand and supply for workers. There's a mismatch of demand and supply for things as well. And we hope that that'll become better aligned in the coming 6 to 12 months as well.
You gentlemen just referenced two things that I wanted to talk about a little bit. One is climate change, which I'll get to in just a moment. But the other, Mark, is the difference in perception and reality, particularly with respect to American citizens' attitude about the economy writ large. I've seen the same polling data, not nearly to the extent that you have, but you have such a disparity among Americans about how they feel the economy is doing. And of course, you have some people who evaluate the economy solely in terms of the stock market. But why are people looking at this through two completely different prisms?
Well, I think, first of all, we have this polarized climate, and I'm not talking about weather or temperatures on the planet, but I'm talking about the society in which we live. And unfortunately, I think all of us in this conversation are, I'll use the word senior enough to think about the days when...
Thank you.
So gentle. That was nice. Little kindnesses, especially around holiday time.
I'm sorry,
it's
I had to
wonderful.
Especially when we're getting ready to flip the calendar.
Don't let me interrupt.
But, we can think back to the days when essentially people got their news from sources that were in common, right? And that's from where the phrase broadcasting came. But these days, we know that sources of information have become quite fractionalized. And unfortunately, the ease of disseminating information has been matched by the ease of disseminating misinformation and disinformation. And so I think that helps to explain to some degree where we are. And also the climate in Washington has changed so much in recent decades. As I mentioned, I come from Kansas, and Bob Dole, who just passed away, was as fierce a partisan advocate as there was, but he also understood broadly that there was a point at which you have to forego prioritizing party over country. And unfortunately, that is not a take which is universally held in the modern political world in the United States of America. And so it's in this world now where disinformation and misinformation becomes so commonplace that, first of all, I think people do latch on to bad information, but even where they get what we might agree is accurate information or valid information, there's unfortunately a tendency to gravitate toward one's, I'm going to call it political tribe, rather than to think about the greater good. And I don't know how we get to adequate solutions in our country with so many huge problems that need to be tackled if we can't have some coming together and acknowledging that there are some basic truths that we need to acknowledge, and that is among the things that worries me most about the outlook for our country.
Really interesting. You're talking about this tribalization, which is, I think is the most alarming problem that we have right now. Could we get to the point where we're moving toward, among other things, two different economies based on tribalism?
Well, I mean, I think there's always essentially coexisting cohorts, if you will, to the extent that, I understand, having worked in this realm for many years now, that let's just say we talk about the fact that the nation's unemployment rate in November was 4.2%. Or that there was a record number of job openings in recent months, including a still high number of 11 million job openings in November. I can tell you as sure as that I was born many years ago, that if I post, as I very often do, something that gets promoted by the good people at LinkedIn on LinkedIn, just merely citing those facts, that people immediately take issue with the fact itself, not necessarily taking issue with the interpretation of it, but just taking issue with the fact, right? And so the problem and the challenge and the opportunity really is to say, here are some numbers, but as they like to say in the disclaimer in TV with respect to investments, your results may vary, right? And so your results may well vary, or and your experience may well vary, but that doesn't make this other fact wrong. And so we have communities all across the country, and that could be a community that's in a house, or it could be in a community that is defined by a zip code, that have not participated in the decades-long economic expansion, if we sort of look at it as a long-term dynamic, understanding that we did have a recession that lasted 2 months. Because in some communities, a recession has persisted for decades, and that's true also for certain groups, in a sense, that have not participated in the wealth creation that's occurred. So, I think that we do have to try to have some empathy for those that are irritated by the reporting of these broad brushstroke statistics, because there's a huge component of the American population which is financially fragile. And so we can talk about the Dow Industrials average or home prices posting stellar returns, but if we've not fed at that trough, so to speak, it's easy to become resentful about that lack of participation. And if one has been also feeding at the trough of disinformation or misinformation, we see how some unfortunate arguments can be perpetuated as well.
Mark, right now we talk about the Great Resignation. When we look ahead to the summer or maybe this time next year, will we still be talking about the Great Resignation, or will there be a new term for it? I don't know, the Great Comeback, the Great Satisfaction, anything like that?
I don't know is the quick answer, but I think that there's a reasonable expectation that the economy should continue to perform well. And if the unemployment rate goes where it may well be headed, and that's into the 3% range. Remember, we had a low of 3.5% in February of 2020, which was the lowest level in about 50 years. That's going to be a very good situation for workers. And I think one of the things that Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell and others is continuing or are continuing to look for is, do we get people returning to the workforce? We had a high level of people departing the workforce, predominated by women. That was at a time when they populated some of the professions and jobs that were most at risk during the pandemic. And of course, if school is interrupted, meaning that children couldn't attend school or there was a sick person in the household, the reality of the world is, at least in the United States, that the women more often than not were the people who said, well, looks like I'll be the one to stay home. So there's been another source of lack of workers in our economy, and that has been the lack of solutions on the legislative front with regard to providing a path for legal immigration. And I can go back to the 1980s when President Reagan was in office, and we had bipartisan legislation on immigration reform. But in a time when we have members of Congress essentially unable to fund the government on a long-term basis, or seeming to struggle to raise the debt ceiling, even though they had already committed to those expenditures. Some of these, getting back to the issue we mentioned a few minutes ago, trying to achieve broader solutions on challenging problems like immigration have a cost. And part of that is that many industries and enterprises don't have the workers that they would typically have had in the past.
Mark, in passing a moment ago, you referenced climate change, and true confession time, I get really put out and exasperated with climate change deniers. At this point, it really is scientifically case closed, not only that we have climate change, not just changes in the weather, but that it is to a large extent caused by human activity. Here's kind of my rebuttal to that. There's nobody in the world that looks at things in a more objective, cold, analytical way than guys like you, economists. And economists are spending more and more time telling us what the economic impact of climate change is already having and is going to have. And then the other group would be the United States military, that now clearly on record considers climate change a national security issue.
No, absolutely. And, professionally, I like to say that I'm politically agnostic. And, I don't have any incentive to try to raise attention about climate change, other than in the sense that I'm asked about it. I go on the Weather Channel and talk about it. I've asked Federal Reserve officials about it. I've done an off-the-record briefing with Federal Reserve officials about it, where I ask them what they're thinking. And when you look at sort of a ledger of the biggest risks for the U.S. and global economies, as well as those that are as diverse as everywhere from the state of Arizona, which has a water shortage problem, not to mention heat, as well as South Florida, which risks sea level encroachment and flooding in incredible ways. And here I am in Maryland, having been on the Eastern Shore this summer, and I can just see where the sea level rise is affecting historic communities in a heartbreaking way. It would be a failure of me to do my job if I did not try to look at the risks that are associated with climate change, and also acknowledge the impacts that climate-related events have had on the economy in recent years. And they're becoming more common, whether it's a historic rainstorm in New York City that washes out subway stations and floods part of Manhattan, or as we mentioned earlier, the very damaging and expensive event in Texas in February of last year, wildfires in California, and other events all around the world. And so just to the extent that they create risk and uncertainty for individuals' personal finances and the economy at large, these are the reasons that we draw attention to this.
Mark, the name of this show is Radically Rational, and I'm going to tell you more than you probably want to know about this. But we founded this effort because we're having a reaction to the post-truth, post-fact world that we find ourselves in. We have people who are now untethered from facts, to the point that not only do they not agree with established facts, they deny them, and in some cases, they deny the very concept of facts. It seems to me that we're now in a little bit uncharted territory. Specifically with respect to economics. What impact has that had?
Well, I would say from a broader perspective, one of the biggest challenges that we face right now is illiteracy. And it's not just the inability to read, because that's the sort of the broad definition of illiteracy. But I'm thinking about the lack of literacy on personal finances and the economy. Think about political illiteracy, civic illiteracy, and you can extend that to climate change and all those other topics. So to bring it back to our realm, personal finances, we need people to be capable of understanding basic concepts with respect to the economy, business, and how they might conduct their personal financial lives. And so when we're in a world where essentially our elected officials don't seem to make it a priority to have, let's just say, wise decisions being made on economic issues, and the debt ceiling, or the inability to essentially decide to spend money and then decide where you're going to get that money from, either on a tax revenue basis or to cut spending so you can shift that government funding elsewhere. These basic questions are not even being dealt with at all by our elected officials, or if they are, they're only taking expeditious solutions that are less than optimal, to say the very least. So if we don't have essentially the people that we look to as our leaders to make good decisions on this, where's that leadership going to come from? And in a world where I've essentially made my career in trying to just seek truth and speak the truth, I think that we can add value by highlighting some of these problems, and hope that to some degree people who are out there will make it a priority to, in their own lives, seek truth, and also highlight accurate reporting and accurate information.
Okay, Mark, we have some folks who are watching this and they're saying, okay, I get it, the Great Resignation. I hear what Mark is saying. With what you do and how you do it, when you look ahead, and they might ask the question, I'm thinking about making a change in my life. I'm thinking about resigning. I'm thinking about getting something else in my life. Do you heed advice? What do you say to them?
Anthony, it's a great question, and I think that very often, people face all kinds of challenges, whether it's because maybe they didn't have an opportunity to get education as a young person, or maybe because either they did or didn't have a level of wealth in their household. To the degree that we can prioritize our own personal finances, really is the first step toward owning them and succeeding with them. And so what do I mean by that? Well, in the worlds that I think we all inhabit, we understand that work is the primary means toward achieving that end. And so what can you do to improve your career? Does that mean becoming an innovator in the job that you currently have to the degree that you can either do it differently or better? Does it mean that you can attain some skills, even if it's something as simple as watching some online videos to learn a new skill that might be more in demand? Or do you need to seek formal education, which in this new environment is more often available via online training? The world is quite innovative. There have been a lot of innovations that have been brought forward during the pandemic, and there is tremendous opportunity in the United States as well as abroad. Most people don't want to move outside the United States if they're already here. But mobility in the United States is one of our historic strengths and trends. And so, if one has to move either across the country or in the neighborhood or across the city, that may be called for. But I would draw attention to the fact that in a world where there is a high number of job postings for remote work, that may now become somewhat more of an antiquated notion. So if one has access to broadband internet, and we hope the people who are watching here today have that, and that might even be on just a smartphone, but so be it. There is tremendous opportunity out there, and that is one of the strengths of the USA. And while life isn't the same now as it was 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago, some of those changes have been positive. Some of them have not. But I would encourage people to check out bankrate.com. It's a free site. And the reason why I'm saying that is because there's so much information on our site to help people achieve what they want to achieve with their personal finances, whether it's understanding a little bit more about something as popular as cryptocurrency that carries risks, but some people have gained, wealth from it. But understand that, just because it's a new thing doesn't mean it's necessarily entirely a better thing, but it is the shiny new thing. Just using it as an example, we have tons of information on the site about that and just about anything else that you might want to achieve with your personal finances.
Mark, you have been so generous with your time. We appreciate that, and we also really appreciate the depth of your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us here on Radically Rational, and we wish you and everybody all the best as we head into the new year.
No, Paul and Anthony, it's a great pleasure. Glad to be part of your conversation. Thanks for allowing me to be part of it, and happy holidays and happy new year to everybody.
Thank you very much, Mark.
That was anything but a dismal conversation, and we thank you.
Yes.
All right. Mark Hamrick, the Chief Economic Analyst at Bankrate, with some really fascinating stuff here. And Anthony, one thing I wanted to ask you about, really the pandemic has impacted all of this.
It has.
So we're all kind of speculating a little bit. How many of the pandemic changes that we had to make just to survive and get along and perpetuate our existence, how many of those and what type are these that we found, you know what, that's actually a pretty good idea that we can perpetuate?
Exactly. As Mark mentioned, the working from home, even working with just a smartphone. Like I've had to become resourceful over the past year, and in previous years, thinking about working from home was like, no way. There's no way I want to work from home. Now I can see, where there are the advantages and where you can make a few dollars by working at home. Some businesses still existing and saving money by having employees work from home. That's not so bad. But, also, if it means maintaining a job and a nice living, let's, continue to do it. So that's what I've kind of seen over the past year.
There is something kind of reinforcing and uplifting about the Great Resignation when you look at people's motivation. Okay, I now am going to make an effort, because I see an opportunity here, to live the life that I really want to live, and more on my terms, with more work-life balance, with more opportunities to enrich myself intellectually, to enjoy my life a little more. That's got to be a good thing.
The term, the Great Resignation, it doesn't mean you're a quitter. So you can resign in what you're doing to just shuffle over into something else that maybe fits you more, that makes you happy. So it doesn't mean you're a quitter.
Mark framed it as an opportunity, and sometimes necessity is, as they say, the mother of opportunity. So an interesting thing for sure. And one of the things I enjoyed about this conversation so much was it's so consistent with our theme here on Radically Rational.
Yeah.
That you really have to look at these things as analytically as you can, and with a look at the big picture. And it really has become, I don't know, kind of my cause in life right now. This idea that we have detached ourselves and untethered ourselves from facts, that is about as indicative of social decay as anything I could think of.
It is. And what Mark did today was just bring us facts.
Right.
As he mentioned, there's no political party with it. It's just facts. And he is preaching his facts to anyone who will listen.
We want to thank you for watching Radically Rational, the podcast, and invite you to visit our website. We think it's kind of fun at radicallyrational.com. Got all kinds of good stuff on there. Got daily news analysis and blogs. Same thing for sports, daily videos. All of our podcasts here are archived. And now we really rock because we got regular contributions from Anthony Pittman.
You're too kind, Paul. I will be here. You just call and I'll be here. Let's make it a regular thing.
You can count on that.
We have some good guests coming up in the future too, so.
I don't know that we have any other kind. And thank you for being such a great booker on these things. So
all good.
Big things coming on Radically Rational as we head into the new year. So until next time, keep in mind, we're bringing facts back into fashion, and we're just trying to make simple sanity sexy again. See you next time.